We're all about trimming waste, fraud, and abuse these days, right? If I told you that there's a government system that costs more than the alternative, takes longer to produce results, requires more lawyers, more hearings, more bureaucracy by far, and still manages to deliver inconsistent outcomes, you'd count that as waste, right? You'd probably assume I was talking about something like, I don't know, defense contracting, maybe healthcare, maybe the IRS on a bad day. You probably wouldn't think that I'm talking about punishment, the most severe punishment that the state can carry out. But I am, because the system I'm describing is capital punishment. Now, before we go any further, let me draw a line right here so as not to get lost. This is not an episode about whether the death penalty is moral. It's not about whether it's constitutional. It's not even about cruel and unusual punishment. Those arguments are all episodes in and of themselves that maybe we'll take on at some later date, but those are different conversations, and people have them all the time loudly. But that's not what this is. This is about money. Just money. Taxpayer dollars, budget costs, trade-offs, the kind of stuff that usually gets buried under slogans and talking points. Because when you actually follow the money on this, when you strip away all the rhetoric and just look at what it costs to run this system, capital punishment starts to look a lot less like justice at its most efficient and more like one of the least efficient systems we've ever built. And that, neighbors, is saying something. Happy Monday, everyone, and welcome to Your Neighbor on the Left, the podcast where we talk about progressive politics, human decency, and life on the blue side of America's ideological divide. My name is Don Spielis, and I am your host. And today we are talking about capital punishment. But as I said in the cold open, this is not going to be a conversation about morality and a conversation about ethics and those topics. While this subject is fertile for those types of conversations, I want to make that clear right off the bat, just in case anybody would decide that they didn't want to continue to listen since they've already heard all the arguments for and against capital punishment in those categories. Now, this one is about the dollars and the cents. Now, here's the thing. For a lot of people, the death penalty feels like the simplest answer in the world. You commit the worst possible crime, you face the ultimate consequence. Case closed, end of story. And built into that idea, whether people say it out loud or not, is this assumption that it's also the practical option. It's faster, it's cheaper, of course it's final, because think about how it gets framed. You hear people say things like, why are we spending decades housing someone, feeding them, paying for their medical care, when we could just carry out the sentence? And on the surface, that sounds like a fair question. Why are we paying to keep someone alive in prison for the rest of their life? Why should taxpayers be on the hook for that? That argument has a kind of gut-level logic to it. It feels efficient and decisive. It feels like you are cutting through red tape. And if your understanding of the system is basically one trial, one verdict, one sentence, and then an execution, then yeah, I guess it would seem cheaper if you think about it that way. Of course it does, but well, in that version of reality, you are comparing a short legal process and a single outcome versus decades of incarceration with ongoing costs. But here's the problem. That version of reality that I just described doesn't exist. Not in the United States, not in any modern legal system that's even pretending to follow due process. Because in reality, the death penalty is not faster. And it is not simpler, and it definitely is not cheaper. In fact, it's the opposite on all three counts. It's slower, it's much more complicated, and it is dramatically more expensive. Even in states that barely use it anymore, we're still paying for it. And once you start to see how the system actually works, that gap between what people think it is and what it actually is not small, it's massive. So let's stop talking about what it feels like and start looking at what it costs, because the numbers will tell you a very different story. So let's actually follow the money, because up to this point, what I've been talking about lives in that space of assumption, what people think the system is and what it feels like it should cost. But once you start digging into actual studies, state budgets, and line items, you realize pretty quickly that this isn't like a gray area. This isn't one of those debates where both sides sort of have a point and it just depends on how you look at it. No. Across the country, different states, different politics, different legal systems, they all keep landing in the same place. The death penalty costs more. Not a little more, a lot more. According to the Death Penalty Information Center, which compiles data from state studies and commissions, this pattern shows up over and over and over again. So take California. Now, California does a lot of things differently than, I don't know, say places like Texas or Florida. Very different politics, different courts, different everything. And yet, a 2011 analysis found that since reinstating the death penalty in 1978, California has spent about $4 billion more than it would have if it had just sentenced those same individuals to life without parole. $4 billion. That's not a rounding error. That's not bureaucratic fluff. That's a whole separate system layered on top of the one that we already have. And it doesn't stop there. In Maryland, a study found that a single death penalty case costs around $3 million, about $1.9 million more than a comparable case where the sentence is life without parole. Same crime, same defendant, same basic legal process, but a different outcome, wildly different price tag. Kansas looked at it and found that capital cases cost about 70% more than non-capital cases. 70%. That's not subtle. That's the system screaming, hey, this thing you think is efficient, it isn't. And then you've got states like Florida and North Carolina where studies have shown they're spending tens of millions of dollars more every year maintaining the death penalty than they would without it. Every year. Not one-time costs, but ongoing annual costs. So when you zoom out, different states, different regions, different political ideologies, but very similar result. The death penalty costs more money everywhere. Now, if you're sitting there thinking, yeah, okay, but maybe that's just those states, let me try and bring it a little closer to home, at least for me. Here in Pennsylvania, we still have the death penalty on the books. We still run capital trials. We still maintain death row facilities. Now, as far as the executions, they've been effectively paused for years under a moratorium. So what does that mean? It means we're paying to maintain the entire system without actually carrying out the final step. The meter's running, but the cab never reaches the destination. And That's not a knock on Pennsylvania specifically. It's just reality, because this is what the system looks like when you stop thinking about it in abstract terms and you start looking at the actual receipts. So now the question becomes, how? How does something that's supposed to be a shorter path, a more final path, end up costing so much more money? Where is all that money actually going? Because it's not just disappearing into the ether. It's being spent very deliberately at every single step of the process. And once you see those steps, once you actually walk through how this system works, that price tag starts to make a whole lot more sense. All right, so remember where we started. The death penalty is supposed to be quicker, cheaper option. Keep that in the back of your mind as we walk through this, because once you see how the system actually works, it's almost impossible to unsee it. We'll start at the beginning. 2 trials. Imagine you're on a jury. You sit through weeks of testimony, you hear evidence, you deliberate, and eventually you come back with a verdict. Guilty. In most cases, that's the end of the big show. The judge handles the sentencing, maybe there's some back and forth, and then the case moves into the appeals phase. But not here. In a death penalty case, the trial doesn't end when you decide guilt. It starts again. Now you move to what's called the penalty phase. Same courtroom, same case, same defendant, but now the entire focus shifts from did they do it to do they deserve to die for it? In that second phase, it's not just a quick addendum. It's its own full-blown proceeding. More witnesses, more evidence, more arguments, weeks, sometimes months, stacked on top of the original trial. Now, right out of the gate, you've effectively doubled one of the most expensive parts of the entire process. And we're just getting started. Now think about the lawyers. In a standard criminal case, you've got a prosecution team and a defense attorney, maybe a small team behind them. But in a capital case, that scales up. Because when the state is trying to take someone's life, the courts require a higher level of representation. Multiple defense attorneys, often with specialized experience in capital cases. Mitigation specialists whose entire job is to dig into the defendant's background, childhood, mental health, trauma, anything that might argue against a death sentence. There's investigators, there's support staff. And then on the prosecution side, they're not exactly cutting corners either. So now you've got 2 fully loaded legal teams operating for longer periods of time on a more complex case. Every hour billed, every motion filed, every hearing scheduled, and the meter keeps ticking. Now let's jump back for a second to that jury box, because not just anyone can sit on a jury in a death penalty case. You need what's called a death qualified jury, meaning every juror has to be willing in principle to impose the death penalty. Now think about what that does in terms of jury selection. Instead of just finding 12 people and alternates who can be fair and impartial, now you are screening for a very specific set of beliefs. That process takes longer, sometimes a lot longer. More questioning, more dismissals, more back and forth between attorneys. Days turn into weeks before the trial even really gets going. And again, more time, more personnel, more cost. Now, layer in expert witnesses, because in the penalty phase, especially, both sides bring in specialists. Psychologists to talk about mental state, forensic experts to re-examine evidence, social historians to piece together a defendant's life story, medical experts, behavioral experts, you name it. And these people are not showing up for free. They're billing for their time, their analysis, their testimony, their preparation time. Each expert is another line item. Another expense added to the pile. Okay, now let's say the trial is over. The jury has decided the sentence is death. In a lot of people's minds, this is where the clock starts ticking towards execution. But in reality, this is where the longest and most expensive phase begins, because every death sentence triggers automatic appeals. Not optional. They're not once in a while. These are mandatory. The case automatically goes through state appellate courts, then federal courts. Issues are raised, evidence is reexamined, procedures are scrutinized, and this doesn't happen over a few months. We're talking years, often decades. In many cases, the original conviction gets challenged, overturned, retried, which means you're back to the courtrooms, attorneys, experts, all that over again. So now you're not just paying for one trial, you're paying potentially for multiple versions of the same case spread out over decades. And yeah, this is exactly the kind of thing that happens in places like Pennsylvania, where cases can stretch on for years and years before anything is finally resolved. Now, while all of that is happening, the person convicted is still incarcerated, but not in general prison population. Death row is different. There's higher security, there's more isolation, there's more staffing requirements. It costs more per inmate to house someone on death row than it does to house someone serving life without parole. So even the holding pattern phase of this system turns out to be more expensive. So when you stack all of that together, 2 trials instead of 1, larger legal teams, longer jury selection, more experts, decades of appeals, higher incarceration costs, you start to see the shape of it. This isn't one expensive step. It's a system built out of expensive steps. Every layer designed to add scrutiny, add process, add protection. And every one of those layers comes with a price tag. So now we've answered the how. We know where the money goes, but there's still one question hanging out there, and it's the obvious one. If this system is this complicated, this slow, and this expensive, why don't we just simplify it? Why not cut some of those steps down, streamline the process, and make it more efficient? On the surface, that sounds like a logical fix, and it's the one that you hear a lot of voices yelling for. But once you understand why all of these layers exist, that idea starts to fall apart pretty quickly. So at this point, as I said, a pretty natural question is forming. Why not just simplify the system? Shorten the trials, limit the appeals, streamline the process, make it efficient. Well, on paper, that sounds reasonable. In fact, it probably sounds like the obvious fix. But here's the problem with that idea, and it's a big one. According to the Death Penalty Information Center, since 1973, more than 195 people in the United States have been sentenced to death only to be later exonerated. Now let that sink in for a second. Not had their sentences reduced, not given parole, not caught on a technicality. Exonerated, meaning the system got it wrong, completely wrong. And that number, that's just the cases that we know about. A study published in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences estimated that at least 4% of people sentenced to death may be innocent. 4%. Now think about that in real terms. If you had a system where 4 out of every 100 outcomes could be completely wrong, you wouldn't call that reliable. You wouldn't call that efficient. I think you would call that a problem. And once you accept, even just for a second, that system can get it wrong, everything else we talked about starts to make sense. Because now you don't get to have a fast system. You don't get to have a cheap system. You can't cut corners because this isn't a mistake that you can undo later. This is final. So what do? We build safeguards. We require multiple attorneys. We bring in experts. We dig into someone's entire life history. We stretch jury selection into weeks. We allow for appeals that can last decades. Every single layer we talked about exists for a reason. Every delay, every motion, every dollar spent is there because somewhere along the line, the system proved it could make catastrophic mistakes. So when people ask, why is the death penalty so expensive? That is your answer right there. It's expensive because it has to be careful. And the only way to make it cheaper would be to make it less careful. I don't know about you, but the idea of executing someone who didn't commit the crime, I don't think of that as a rounding error, as an acceptable loss. I think of that as an abomination. So no, you can't just trim the system down like it's an over-budget project, because the parts you'd be cutting are the parts that keep it from doing irreversible damage. Now, with that in mind, everything we've talked about, the cost, the delays, the complexity, it all leads to a pretty uncomfortable realization, because if the system is built this way on purpose, and it still costs more, and it still takes longer, then what exactly are we getting in return? So we've got a system that takes longer to reach the final outcome, costs significantly more at almost every stage, and still produces inconsistent results depending on the state, the case, the lawyers involved. Now compare that to life without parole. Life without parole doesn't require a second trial to decide whether someone should die. It doesn't require the same level of prolonged, specialized litigation. It doesn't trigger the same decades-long appellate process in the same way. And once the sentence is handed down, that's it. It's stable, it's predictable, it's final in its own way. And crucially, it's cheaper. So, if your goal is punishment, if your goal is to remove someone from society permanently for protection of society at large plus their punishment, life without parole gets you there faster at a much lower cost. That's just simply the reality. Now, here's where it gets uncomfortable. Because the death penalty is often framed as the tougher option, the more serious option. The one that says, we mean business. We're tough on crime. But if you strip away the symbolism and just look at performance, you've got a system that is more expensive, slower, and less consistent than the alternative. If this were business, if this were any other system we designed to produce results, it would have been shut down a long time ago. It would have been replaced with something more efficient. Something that actually does the job it's supposed to do. And then there's this extra layer, this wrinkle that makes it even harder to ignore, because in some states, we're not even using the system we're paying for. As I said, in Pennsylvania, we have death penalty on the books. We hold capital trials. We maintain death row facilities. We fund that entire structure, but executions have been effectively paused for years. So in practice, what does that mean? It means we're paying for the most expensive version of the system without ever carrying out the final step. We're maintaining the machinery, keeping it oiled and staffed and operational, but not actually ever turning it on. And again, this isn't about whether that's morally right or wrong. That's a different discussion. From a dollars and cents perspective, it's just almost impossible to justify. Because now you're not just talking about a system that costs more to do the same job. You're talking about a system that costs more and in some places doesn't complete the job it was built to do. So at this point, you've got to ask the obvious question. If it costs more and it takes longer and it doesn't consistently deliver what it promises, what exactly are we paying for? Because at some point, this stops being a question about all the courtrooms and legal procedures and starts just being a question about priorities. what are we actually funding here? It's not efficiency. It's not cost effectiveness. And in some cases, it's not even implementation. Then what is it? Part of the answer, of course, is political. The death penalty has been for a long time a kind of shorthand, a way for politicians to signal toughness. And that signal has value politically. Even if the underlying system is wildly expensive and inefficient and rarely used. There's also an emotional component, because for a lot of people, the idea of the death penalty isn't about spreadsheets or budgets. It's about justice. It's about a sense that certain crimes deserve the ultimate punishment. And again, that's a real conversation. It's just not the one that we're having today. Today, we're just looking at the argument that keeping someone housed in prison for their entire life is a burden on taxpayers that executing them would eliminate. We're just looking at what it costs to maintain that idea. And the answer is a lot of money, a lot of time, a lot of resources that could be going somewhere else. And across the country, we keep funding it. Even in states where it's barely used. Even in states where it's effectively paused, we maintain the infrastructure, we keep the system alive. We pay for the most complex, most expensive version of criminal punishment, whether we're actually using it or not. And like I said, in places like Pennsylvania, it's not even about carrying out the executions anymore. It's about maintaining the option. We're paying to maintain the option, keeping it there just in case. So when you step back and look at all of this, it's hard to escape the conclusion we're not just spending more money. We're spending more money for a system that does less of what it promises to do. All right, so let's come back to where we started. We didn't debate morality. We're not arguing philosophy. We didn't get into whether the death penalty is right or wrong. That's a different conversation. We just followed the money. We looked at what it costs, how it works, and what we get in return. And sometimes following the money tells you more about what we value than anything we say out loud. Because if you wanted to design the most inexpensive, least efficient version of justice possible, you wouldn't fix this system. You'd build it exactly the way it already exists. All right, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to download and listen to this episode of Your Neighbor on the Left. I want to hear from you guys. I want to know what your thoughts are on this. I know there's a lot of you out there on both sides of the aisle who think that capital punishment isn't necessarily a deal breaker, and I want to hear your thoughts, specifically about the cost-benefit analysis. But whatever you want to say, if you go to the website www.neighborontheleft.com, you'll find the contacts page that has all the social media links as well as an email address, and you can use any of them to reach out to the podcast and let me know what you think about this episode or any other topic for that matter. There's also a episodes page where you can either stream or download any episode of the podcast that goes all the way back to episode number 1. And of course, I post to the blog on the website, posts that mirror the things that I talk about in the podcast, and I include all of my sources. At the bottom, there's a list of sources with links. So I will be back on Wednesday with another full episode of Your Neighbor on the Left. Between now and then, do me a favor and stay engaged, stay kind, and have the kind of week you'd wish for others.